will throw yourself at any opportunity to work with them because they're just amazing people, and when you're together, you can do great things. The problem is, these people are scattered to the winds right now. They're all over the place. So one of the things that, you know, with, if I were giving you the normal corporate presentation here, I'd be talking about all the tools and services we have and why you should be going cloud native and the other things. But I'm going to take my Google hat off for a minute, put on the producer hat, and talk a bit more about the collaborative part. Obviously, we have a gazillion tools available in our cloud. There are other cloud providers that have a gazillion tools as well. But suffice it to say, we're focusing very much on the entire ecosystem of production, from pre-production all the way through the archiving side. So we're spending a lot of time on all of these, trying to address the very specific needs of what happens in the creative process. And again, my personal mantra, let's eliminate the progress bars. So we are looking at the entire food chain here, and sort of the important facets of this for us are to be open about it. We do a lot of work in the open source community. It's really important to drive things forward. So we don't want to be very proprietary about everything. We want to be intelligent about it, so, and as part of that, there's only so many hours in the day. I talk to reality TV editors who have hundreds of hours of footage to look through each week to make a 1-hour show. It's ridiculous, the shooting ratios that are out there. So we can now apply intelligence through artificial intelligence and machine learning to be able to leverage what resources we do have by figuring out the tasty bits that are in there, so we can actually make reasonable programming by knowing what's in there, because right now there's just too much content to even look at for most of these folks. But collaboration, again, is really what I'm here to preach today, and that lends itself to this idea of being secure. You know, in terms of collaboration, again, I apologize for this to sound like a sales pitch, but we've now gotten to the point, many of us have tried for years to be collaborative, work with people in different cities, different time zones, all of that stuff. And the problem has been we're constantly waiting for files to be uploaded or downloaded, or QuickTimes didn't make it in time, or they get the wrong version of this, that, or the other thing. And it becomes a very frustrating exercise. So for a long time, this idea of truly collaborating was this harebrained baling wire and tape thing where there'd be a video camera pointed at a screen in one city and trying to do some live stream to another city, and it's just broken and silly. So to suffice it to say, we have enough tools now across the board where collaboration is really possible. I work in a company where we have 100,000 people, we're spread all over the planet, and I regularly work with people in multiple countries every week, and we're incredibly productive because the tools are already in place. They're no longer that impediment that we have. So as I mentioned, you know, we're really here to talk about the content side of things. There's been this enormous explosion of the volume of content that's been being created these days. We're talking, you know, the average footprint of a feature film with visual effects, for example, at the end of the day, when they deliver all the assets to the studio for archiving, the average footprint is around 8 petabytes of media. That's crazy, absolutely crazy. I remember working on movies where our whole archive was maybe 100 terabytes when we get done, and we thought, oh my God, what are we doing with all of this storage? We don't need all this. And now we're up at the petabyte range. So, as I mentioned, we have tighter timelines and everything. The expectations are through the roof creatively, and we have these workforces that are all over the planet. And again, getting back to the point of working with the people you like to work with, this is a great opportunity now to actually be able to collaborate. Of course, contract distribution further down the chain complicates things because it used to be that you would deliver an American release and didn't really care about the North American release. You didn't care about the foreign versions because they weren't going to get released for 6 more months. Now everything is day and date. You literally have dozens of versions going out the door, all with their own unique characteristics, whether it's subtitling or replacement shots, replacement dialogue, all sorts of things that further complicate this idea of trying to meet a day-to-day release when you have to release in 35 countries at the same time. So these problems are all compounded by the fact that, again, how many of you have ever waited to get some creative thing done because the hard drive didn't make it from FedEx? Yeah. Yeah, see, we've all done that. And it's not FedEx's fault. So I am here to pitch this idea of working in the cloud. Although in this day and age, there's a bunch of different ways to work in the cloud. But you know, we've gone from this analog era into this point where we can now work. We have facilities that are fairly robust on premise, but my argument today is to kind of skip over the hybrid cloud part of it and go right to multi-cloud when it comes to production. And the reason I say that is because Hybrid cloud right now means that you still have to have a lot of resources on-prem, and you have to have a very quick connection to the cloud if you're sharing resources, and then you'll realize very quickly that's a bottleneck. And not everybody, if you're trying to collaborate with people around the world, has access to the stuff that's on premises. So it becomes a real kind of challenge. So here's just a quick visual that I want to show you. When you have your assets that you've created on the film, which are solid gold, right? They're absolute gold assets. They're all of the value in everything you're doing. So let's say you have two vendors on a project, visual effects vendors, and they happen to be in different places. You have to find a scheme to get these assets to these people, and it takes all different forms. You've got not only the visual data or sound data or whatever it might be, but you also have financial data, you have documents, you have schedules, you have all sorts of things that have to be shared with these folks. So in a traditional sense, if you're working on-prem, you're sending these files, whatever they might be, to these vendors, wherever they might be, in whatever mode you send it in. How many of you have Aspera accounts? Probably everybody who does production has an Aspera account. So the idea is you're having to send all these assets to your vendors. Okay, great. And then they make the movie. This is awesome. So now, at the end of the movie, the studio needs all their assets back. So a bunch of stuff comes back. But the question is, did you really get it all back? You probably didn't. In fact, what you probably got was copies of stuff back. And there's no malicious intent necessarily. I'm just saying there's no way to contain what's out there. And that's a big problem these days. People are worried about leaking, especially when there's this day-and-date release issue. Nobody wants to reveal the big finish of the series on HBO, for example. So you want to be careful about where these assets are. But how do you contain this if there are assets that you've sent to your vendors that are sitting on their servers and you have no way of knowing when you get it back? So my big pitch for cloud, and in this case, strange as it sounds, I'm saying any cloud, because we live in a hybrid cloud world. There are multiple clouds out there to work with. Luckily at Google, we work with all of the cloud providers to make sure that you understand what's going on with your processes, whether it's in the compute side or whether it's the storage and all the other things. So you can actually manage it all from our side. But the fact is we live in a multi-cloud world. You're going to have stuff everywhere. So now the idea is when you have production assets, if you move everything to the cloud, and I do mean everything, all of your compute, all of your storage, all of your processes, your workflows, you'll suddenly find that now all you're having to do is grant access to assets that no one ever actually brings down anywhere. In fact, they don't even have the ability to bring those things down. And then when the production is over, you revoke the access, and now you have everything. You have absolutely everything. So the analogy I like to use on this is that of the camera negative. When we used to shoot film, there's only one original camera negative, and that's theoretically treated like it's the gold standard for a movie. I say theoretically because it always amuses me that on film productions back in the day, they'd spend all day shooting this amazing stuff on a negative, and they would give it to the lowest paid employee to drive their beat up old car to the lab with the negative in it. My theory was always that negative should be in a Briggs truck on the way back to the lab, but I digress. So this idea of being able to get back all of your production assets is key. It prevents a lot of problems. It's a very secure way of working. But more importantly, every artist who needs access to those assets has that access if it's been granted to them. So you don't have to worry about waiting for that hard drive that didn't make it from FedEx, or the Aspera connection that keeps going down because the local internet provider has problems or whatever. So I know it's a big pitch to move everything to the cloud. You've probably heard the term lift and shift. I hear it all the time. For certain applications, it kind of sort of makes sense. But think for a second, if you have an on-premise facility where you built this big server farm and over the years you've refined your workflows and you made everything work to a T and it's a finely tuned machine, you can't just lift and shift that to the cloud, because primarily the reason it works is because you put so much care and feeding into making it work the way it works on premise that it makes no sense to translate that whole thing into the cloud. You're dealing with a completely different infrastructure. One other thing I want to show you very quickly, I can talk about machine learning at another time, but part of what we're doing in machine learning is predictability of how long things are going to take. And that's an important thing when you're doing collaboration as well. So we're doing predictive rendering, for example, so that if you're doing fluid simulations or some very complex thing, we can now have a dial in there that says, okay, I want this frame to be done in an hour, no matter how complex it is. And then we just provision the resources behind the scenes to accomplish that. So if it takes hundreds of cores or thousands of cores and tons of RAM and lots of GPUs. All of that stuff is provisioned automatically so that progress can be made. And a producer, again, putting on my producer hat, knows that every shot is going to take the same length of time. Right? So the other reason I don't like the term lift and shift is because a lot of folks are doing this hybrid approach, which means they're only using cloud for burst rendering, which means you've built your facility for a certain capacity that you've all predicted that we're going to use, and some utilization method is figured out. But the reality is, when you hit peak time, you need way more resources than you have, so you rely on the cloud, which is great. It's a great use of it. However, all of these giant files that contribute to, for example, animation or rendering for visual effects, have to be uploaded to cloud, rendered, and then be brought back down, which means you need a very reliable and very robust pipe in your facility that has plenty of bandwidth available to do that. So we constantly run into situations where people really want to do this burst thing. It's the panic moment of the movie trying to get it done, and their internet either goes down or it chokes because there's just not enough throughput. So that's the reason I'm not a huge fan of this idea of burst rendering, because it doesn't take full advantage of the cloud, and if you look at it from a customer's perspective, they're having a bad experience. And it's easy for them to point the finger at whoever the cloud vendor is to say, I don't like cloud because this happened, but it has really nothing to do with cloud other than the fact that your connection to the cloud is somehow compromised, and we as cloud providers can't control that. It's not covered in any SLAs. So the idea is to promote this idea of collaboration as much as you can. Treat your assets like their original camera negatives if you can. And the best way to do that is move your resources to the cloud. It's not as hard as it sounds. And I think the services that all the cloud providers have now are very sophisticated these days. Now it's a question of getting some of the vendors on board. I won't name names, but there's a few key vendors out there with iconic software that everybody seems to use that are hesitant to move to cloud. And I think once we've pushed that over the edge, then this idea of collaboration, working with the people you like to work with, and eliminating progress bars becomes a real thing. So I hope that inspires you to think about cloud a little bit more. Obviously, you have to think a little bit differently as production management side of things on how you keep track of the cost of using cloud, but we have plenty of ways to do that too, because that's one thing you always hear from people. And also this idea of, what if the cloud goes down? Well, what if the power goes out? I worked at Sony, and one day, the city water line out in the street broke. And part of you thinks, well, who cares? Well, it turned out our entire server farm was water cooled from city water. And suddenly the 4 films that we were working on that had a deadline that didn't move had to grind to a halt. Thank goodness we live in Hollywood. You pick up the phone, you call the company that does rain trucks, and you bring a bunch of water trucks to the facility and pump it right into the water system, and you're back and running. But try that in Canada or Michigan or anywhere else. So again, please try and think about this idea of working cloud native, where everything lives in the cloud. You're going to find that the collaboration goes way up. You get to work with the people you like to work with, and you have ultimate control over the process and the cost and everything else. So with that, I know we're behind here a little bit. I just want to leave you that thought. Thank you for your attention, and enjoy the rest of the presentations for today. And for those of you going to the movies, enjoy that too.